Good afternoon, everybody. Shavua Tov. It's been a while and we've really missed you. We know that our briefing schedule has been a little hafuch, as we say here in Israel, a little upside down, but it's because there have been so many Jewish holidays. However, we are at the end of the long stretch of Jewish holidays and are back to normal, bringing you your Israel brief, which is brought to you by Lay of the Land and myself, Rolene Marks. And just to affirm what we do every Monday to Thursdays, we bring you those top stories making headlines in Israel right here on this very social media platform. If you are watching us on Facebook, please consider sharing, like and follow our page. And if you are on YouTube viewing us there, please like, share and subscribe. But on to those top stories, and we begin at the United Nations. Now, because we have had Jewish holidays for the last couple of days, there is a little bit of news to catch up on. And the top story is our Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's maiden speech at the United Nations General Assembly. Every year round about this time in September, world leaders who are member states of the United Nations gather at the headquarters, as they have this year, to address the UNGA. Now, this was the first time that Naftali Bennett, in his capacity as the Prime Minister, would have this opportunity, following in the footsteps of former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And like him or loathe him, this was always seen as the former Prime Minister's real house. So a lot of pressure on Naftali Bennett to deliver a speech, and he really did. The thoughts and the impressions from many of us were that the speech was humble in many places, optimistic in many places, but nevertheless gave a very stern talking to and warning about Iran. So let's take a look at some of the takeaways from the PM speech. He opened up speaking about the Jewish people who had recaptured our language. We were reclaiming our sovereignty in our ancient land. He spoke about the incredible coalition government that he has put together with his partners. He was very humble in this place, speaking about how wonderful it is to have so many different views, so many different political viewpoints sit at a table together. And he said something very important. He said, even though we disagree, he said, it's good to disagree. It's healthy to disagree, because that's where you find solutions. That's where you grow. And I think it was in a lot of reference to how polarized the world has become along the lines of left and right. And he also went on to speak about how Israel is handling the COVID pandemic, areas where we have led, including implementation of the third booster shot. And while there has been quite a lot of criticism that he didn't mention the Palestinians or address Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas's ultimatum that Israel withdraw back to the lines of 1967 like he did in his speech, he mainly reserved the harsh tone of his speech on threats to Israel for Iran. He warned and he said quite clearly that words don't stop centrifuges from spinning, and warned just how ready Iran was to wreak havoc, not just on the Middle East, but for the whole world. And then he said that the threshold has been passed, the time for discussions has been passed. He also went on to thank the 38 countries who chose not to participate in the UN conference against racism, also known as Durban 4. He also said something very important, which might appeal to the younger generation. He said, hating Israel does not make you woke. So he really went out of his way to use that kind of parlance. But largely it was a very conciliatory speech. It was an optimistic speech. And he made no bones about the threat that the region faces and the world faces from Iran. He also went on to speak about the Abraham Accords and spoke about the historic peace that we have with Egypt, then Jordan, and now Morocco, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates. So all in all, even though he didn't use any props as the former Prime Minister used to do, and even though CNN did not broadcast our Prime Minister's speech, speech. It certainly received very, very good reactions. Before jetting back to Israel, he met with the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, and amongst the many things they discussed, he also brought up the subject of anti-Israel resolutions and this almost obsession that the United Nations has with that. So, kol hakavod, Your Excellency, Mr. Prime Minister, and we wish you safe travels back to Israel. Another extraordinary event took place over the weekend, and this was news that nearly 300 prominent Iraqis, both Sunni and Shiite, have said that they would like to enter into a peace with Israel and be part of the Abraham Accords. Now, this is absolutely unprecedented. Israel and Iraq have hostile relations at the moment. Unfortunately, the Iraqi government has issued warrants of arrest for a tribal leader and a minister in the government who have pushed for this, but they stand strong and they have said that even though the government are wholly opposed to this, they will push until there is peace with Israel. And can we just say amen to that? We look forward to expanding our circle of peace, and as our Prime Minister Bennett said, anybody who wants to make peace with Israel will find an outstretched hand. In other news, we've been covering the Ben and Jerry's saga in quite a lot of depth here on the Israel Brief, and the US state of Texas announced that they are going to be making their moves to disinvest from Unilever, which is the holding company of Ben and Jerry's, pulling out their over $100 million pension fund. This will be the third US state to enact their anti-BDS laws. And our final story of the day takes us to the Ukraine. Today we pause and remember that it has been 80 years since the massacre of Babi Yar, also known as Babi Yar. On the 29th and 30th of September 1941, the German Nazis came into the Ukraine, rounded up all the Jews of Kiev, and took them to the outskirts of the city, where nearly 34,000 multiple generations of Jews were shot systematically, one by one, and into the ravine of Babi Yar. Now, post the war, the Soviets would not allow for any kind of commemoration, any kind of acknowledgement of what happened there, wouldn't acknowledge the Jewish victims. And today is a day where we will pause and we will remember this. And hopefully soon there will be memorials at the site that will remember specifically the Jewish victims of the Babi Yar massacre. Whole generations just done away with. We will never forget. We will always remember. And may the memories of all who were brutally murdered on those days, on what was the largest massacre in one day of people, of Jews during the Holocaust, be forever remembered. Those are your top stories, and don't forget to check out our content online at www.layoftheland.online. We have a fascinating story. You can read all about Netzach Israel. This is a program founded by Rabbi Bombach. He is a Haredi rabbi who's looking at ways to improve the education system of the Haredi community so he can integrate them into society and improve the economic situation that that community faces. It is also on our Facebook page, and you know what to do. Like us, follow us, share our content, and invite your friends to as well. We're on YouTube at the Israel Brief. Please like, share, and subscribe by hitting the red subscribe button. And we're on Twitter at Lay of the Land 5. So even though we have been separated these last couple of days and we have missed you, we are happy to be back. I'm Rolene Marks. This is the Israel Brief, and make sure you catch up with your headlines tomorrow.